Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to Wales One World Film Festival. I'm David Gillam, director of the festival, and I'm really pleased to be able to chair this discussion about Fukushima 10 years on. And I have with me Dr. Carl Clowes, who is a doctor in Gwynedd and has worked for 15 years with PAWB, People Against Wylfa B, and Brian Jones, who's vice chair of CND Cymru, and also he's a trustee of Awel Aman Tawe, the renewable energy charity, of which I'm particularly fond. And so the process is really going to be that Carl is going to give us an introduction because he's visited Fukushima, and he's going to do a little PowerPoint and bring us up to date there. And then Brian will come in after that. We'll have a little discussion amongst the three of us and then throw it out to questions from the audience. So Carl, do you want to, well, we need a little bit of a setup here while we share the screen and Carl's PowerPoint presents and appears in front of us, and then Carl will take us through that.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I have visited Fukushima twice, in fact, once with Brian, and it's a salutary experience, I think, for anybody who's never been. Just to remind people of the enormity of the situation at the time, this is one of 3 reactors that exploded following the tsunami, and the results of that are still being felt today, of course, 10 years on. If I can have the next slide, you'll see there the extent of the fallout at the time. So that this is 3 days after the event. People were asked to take shelter in the 20 to 30 kilometer circle is the 2 innermost circles there. But you can see that the plume extends over a wide area, the large area along the coast and moving inland. We've superimposed that, in fact, on Wylfa, on Ynni, and it covers the whole length of the island and onto much of the mainland. So it wasn't anything to be taken lightly, to say the least. A huge amount of the population was affected and remains involved, remains affected. Next slide, please. One of the things I think that's been quite unnerving for those of us who've been campaigning with Wylfa or against Wylfa is that despite the events in Fukushima, the politicians locally, I mean all parties and the local authority, have all been very much in support of a new generation of Wylfa nuclear power, Wylfa B as it's been called, or Wylfa Newydd more recently. And one of the consequences of that interest is that everybody, the Secretary of State for Wales, the MP, the AM, the local leader of the council and so on, they've all visited I was going to say Fukushima, that would have been a Freudian slip. They've all visited Japan. They've all visited Tokyo, and that usually at the behest of Hitachi, wined and dined by them. But did they take the hour and a half on the bullet train up the road to Fukushima region to see the damage that a really serious incident caused? No, they didn't. Not one of them took the time or the trouble or the effort to move up the road to see the other side of nuclear power. So this is what they saw. This is what we saw. This is what they would have seen. Next slide, please. And one of the things I think that we saw when we were in Fukushima, and you'll see it all along the coast there, millions of those bags, this is on a long distance zoom, those like big bale sacks along the coastline, you see the sea beyond on the left there, full of earth that's been clawed off the land from acres and acres and acres, hundreds of acres, thousands of acres by JCBs, taking off the surface soil and stacking it in those bags with nobody really a clue what to do with it. That was really quite frightening to see so many millions of bags, and not just there, but on street corners. People's gardens had all been raked up, as it were, and piled in a similar vein, you began to appreciate the extent of the problem. The other aside to that was the forest, quite a forested area inland. And of course, there's not much you can do about radiation landing on the trees. The snow falls in winter, the drift off then when it melts into the land below and down into the fields back again. So a huge issue there in terms of how that accumulates and what indeed you do with it long term. On the right there, you'll see some prefabs. I'll come back to that perhaps a bit later. I'll try and move on. These are prefabs built up by the government to accommodate the many, many evacuees. Not often understood in this country, not often related, but there were an estimated 168,000 evacuees as a result of those explosions by virtue of the radiation that they suffered in that area. Many of them moved to other parts in Japan. Indeed, some went to the States and elsewhere. But the majority moved to larger cities throughout the country. And some 37,000 reputedly to this day, 10 days on, are still living in that kind of accommodation. Next slide, please. I first became interested in medicine, my background. I first became interested in the impact of nuclear power when I understood some of the impacts of nuclear power stations living within the confines of a nuclear power station. I won't go into detail now, but you can see there, if you're living within 5 kilometers and you're under 5 years of age, the chances of you getting leukemia, this is a German study looking at all 16 nuclear power stations, there's a 120% increase in the likelihood of you getting leukemia. A frightening statistic, denied incidentally by Kamari in the UK. For whatever reason, they came to a different conclusion, but these are well written up statistics, and I have every reason to believe that they're true. Move on, please. We often hear, and I'll just throw this in passing, how nuclear power is essential because it produces power with no carbon dioxide pollution. I just point out these are the levels of CO2 produced per kilowatt hour, and you can see there wind, offshore wind is the lowest one. Next slide. Not to go into too much detail, but you'll see there that nuclear, in fact, is third, albeit much better than gas and coal, but it is third from the bottom of the list. In other words, there's a huge amount of production of carbon dioxide or carbon in the production of nuclear energy. And it's pretty obvious when you think about it, the mining of it, the milling of it, the refining of it, the transporting of it, the building of nuclear power stations, the many years of actual production of nuclear energy perhaps is minimal, but then you've got the whole process of decommissioning and storage and so on, not to mention the waste. Move on, please. Living on this morning as I did for 38 years, it was obvious that one of the main reasons motivating the politicians to support nuclear power was employment. It's the region or district in the whole of the UK with the lowest GVA, which is quite remarkable, really. Often one would imagine that with a nuclear power station, a major employer, that they would have a high GVA, gross value, but it's got the lowest in the whole of the United Kingdom at 53% of the UK average. Moving on, please. I won't go into detail on these. The dark area at the very top is around Wylfa. Lack of affordability for young people in the housing ladder is at its highest in that area. Not surprising. Next slide. The impact of Wylfa on the language has been considerable. Only 4% at the last study of the children in the local school were from Welsh-speaking households. So 3 out of 75 children were from Welsh-speaking households. Again, that you can see the impact. It counters quite clearly what has been said, that you need Wylfa for the benefit of the language to enable people to stay in the area. That is not the evidence as that slide shows. Next, please. So we need a vision. I think PAWB has always maintained a positive view of where the future is, not just campaigning negatively, but these are some of the criteria we adopted for a vision of the future. Next, please. To begin our prospectus or manifesto, as it were, we did a study, commissioned a study from social research in the university, and you'll see there that alternative or renewable energy gained the support of 74% of the population if more energy jobs were to be created on the island, far more than nuclear energy. Next slide, please. And which of the following would you like to see as a means of creating energy? Solar power gained the largest percentage, nuclear power there appearing fourth on the list. Next slide. I think we can move on in the interest of time for today. So there are other options, and we looked at them all in terms of energy production, stating the obvious there, but perhaps the one I'd like just to refer to is conservation of energy, which is something that's often not looked at in terms of energy production. Clearly it isn't, but conservation is usually important. It's felt that we can save something like 30% of the energy we traditionally use. And so moving on, please. And then each of those areas, of course, creates employment. So this was our one of our main imperatives at the end of the day, was to create a number of jobs compatible with those that were needed, not the 8,000 or 10,000, depending on which figures you read from Horizon or from the government, that were likely to be created on the back of Wylfa B, but the numbers that were actually required, those who were on the job seekers list, plus an element allowing for those who move from the county on an annual basis. And these were the numbers we estimated could be created on the back of each of those areas. Moving on, please. And again, ITC, tourism and agriculture. So they're not just in the areas of energy, and it's often lost that decommissioning Wylfa also employed, if it follows the pattern of Trafodaeth, something like 600 people for 20 odd years. So there's a huge amount of employment remaining. Carry on, please. And that gave a grand total there of something like 3,500, which is a much more realistic figure of what we need. On, please. I'm leave you with three last slides. This was an event where we sat in with some of the evacuees. A picture paints 1,000 words. You hardly need to say anything about the picture on the left. That lady was an evacuee. She looked as she was suffering from post-traumatic stress, and I'm sure she was. The lady on the right, this was in her prefab. That was the length and breadth of her accommodation. She may well still be there for all I know. Through a translator, I looked around the room and I asked her, have you got some personal possessions of your family here? No, we weren't allowed to bring any. No photographs at all, I said. No, not one. And that struck me. That was quite well, intimidating in itself, I think. And then what really, I think, brought it home to me was the most worrying thing for her was that she couldn't see her husband, who was buried in a graveyard some 20 kilometers away, and she would never be able to visit his grave. And I think that brought a tear to most of our eyes as we listened to her talking. And then finally, the last slide. I think this is a significant one. This was the gentleman, the second from the right, the former Prime Minister of Japan, Naoto Kan, who visited Wales at our request following our visit, and gave us start warning. We arranged for an event in the Pierhead in Cardiff, met some of the AMs and an invited audience, then flew up to Wylfa and was greeted there by many of our protesters, of course, supporting him. Then I had the privilege, dare I say it, of taking him into the local authority council, Ynni, and he had a polite hearing, but not a very attentive hearing, dare I say it. And then went on to a hotel where there was a a big rally to listen to what he had to say. And his message was quite clear. This was the Prime Minister who had sat through some pretty serious times when the reactors exploded. And from being Prime Minister who had responsibility for nuclear power in Japan, was giving a very clear warning to the local authority, to everybody, don't go there. This is not the way ahead. So he had learned, as it were, by their mistakes, a very stark warning. So I'll finish there for now, and perhaps we can come back to a more up-to-date picture later. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. That's a good quick whistle-stop tour around what's been going on there over the 10 years. So I'm going to go to Brian, who's going to just talk a little bit more about his personal experience of campaigning over the many years.
Thank you. I started almost so we finished it really. One of the first campaigns on nuclear power I was involved in. I was living in Bath at the time, having gone there to university, and the accepted wisdom at the time for disposing of low-level nuclear waste was to put it into an oil drum, pack in as much as you could, fill the oil drum up with cement, transport it by rail to Sharpness, just north of Bristol, obviously quite close to Bath, take it out into the Irish Sea and dump it. And there was a very effective campaign against that. The dumping at sea by the UK government started in 1948, and after a couple of spectacular actions, 1982 was the last year that the UK dumped nuclear waste at sea. And a few years after that, they had reached an international agreement to try and stop dumping nuclear waste at sea. Now, it was quite fortunate for me because I'd been involved in anti-nuclear campaign for about a year and a half at that point. And it was quite nice getting a definite success so early as a campaigner, because since then, it's been, as you can imagine, pretty much a long, hard slog for the next 40 years. And perhaps if I hadn't been involved in that early success, I might not have stuck it out. I don't know. People sometimes ask me, well, what's changed? You've been campaigning all this time, what's changed? And I think it's important to remember at the moment, there are no functioning nuclear power stations in Wales, and long may that continue. When in the 1980s we were campaigning against nuclear power stations, the alternatives, wind farms and solar panels and the like, were, to most people, weren't anything definite. They weren't familiar to people at all. It was like a notion. Whereas now, of course, they're familiar to the vast majority of people and accepted by the vast majority of people as being an effective way to generate electricity, much cheaper than nuclear power, and of course of no nuclear waste long-term issues. I believe I'm right in saying that at the moment, as well as Wales producing more electricity than it uses, we're more than half, just over 50% of the electricity produced in Wales is by renewable sources now, which compared to 15 years ago, when it was about 5%. So that has been a fantastic change. And it's occurred almost under the radar. Not many people will have noticed such a huge change. Some of that has been by community energy groups owning their own generating facilities and keeping the profits within the local area, which would be my preferred way of operating. I had the opportunity when I was teaching to do a teacher exchange to Denmark. And while we were there, it was explained to me that most villages in Denmark owned a wind turbine and they got discounted electricity from their wind turbine, and it was just accepted, and it was wonderful. Obviously, both the Chernobyl accident and the Fukushima accident changed things dramatically. I think Chernobyl changed the minds of an awful lot of ordinary people, shall I say. Whereas with Fukushima, that seemed to have far more of an impact at the governmental and business level. And I say that because people probably remember shortly after the Fukushima accident, Germany said, we're going to phase out nuclear power. Simple as that. And they still are phasing it out. And that was followed by Sweden and Switzerland and South Korea, and most likely Belgium is phasing it out at the moment. And that's brilliant, good news. We've obviously got to carry on campaigning and hope that we can prevent any new build at Wylfa and prevent any of the so-called small modular nuclear reactors, which, although they're described as small, they're a similar sort of power output to the original Hinkley Point A and the Clowes reactors. And they obviously have the same nuclear waste issues long-term to look at. It's also important sometimes just to be positive and hope. I think when I speak to people, attitudes have changed immensely. I was really surprised one day at the leisure centre when this woman I'd never spoke to came up to me one day and said, was that you on the news the other day doing an interview about the Hinkley mud issue? And I said, yes, it was. And he said, well, good for you. You know, everyone's behind you. And that was nice. You know, I'd never spoken to her before. Sadly, since lockdown, I've never spoken to her since. But, you know, there's far more backing for the anti-nuclear position, I think, than we sometimes accept. I think that's all I'll say for now, and see what comes of the discussion.
Thank you, Brian. I'm just going to pick up on that, really. I think it's for those of us who have been doing this sort of thing for 40 years, one of the issues is to change your mindset from thinking that we're in the minority, you know, David against Goliath, to actually saying we're the majority here. We actually represent the people in Wales, and we shouldn't put up with this stuff, you know, and just be a bit more kind of, you know, bullish in that sense. But that's just a personal feeling I have at my, you know, ripe old age. Could you just bring us up to date with the Hinkley mud issue? Because, you know, that's sort of been around and it's come back again. I mean, would you want to just bring us up to date with where that is for people?
Yes, I'll try my best. In building Hinkley Point C, EDF put in to dredge, to create a noding wharf, and to put inlet and outflow pipes for cooling water taken from the Severn Estuary to cool the nuclear power station and then be pumped back into the Severn Estuary. They got a license to do this from NRW. The license was granted on the very first day of NRW's official existence. The application was made when it was the Environment Agency Wales, and then it was rebranded as NRW, and first day the license was given to them. And no one, well, certainly I didn't know of it, and I didn't know anyone who knew anything about it. In 2018, eventually they did some dredging there, but they needed to do more dredging. In the meantime, surprisingly enough, construction at Hinkley Point C, like at many nuclear power stations, was running behind schedule. And I think they'd originally applied for a license thinking that'll cover all the dredging we need to do. But they were so far behind schedule that the license for dumping what they dredged expired in the meantime. And at the moment, they've applied for a new license to dump dredged sediment off Portishead on the Bristol side of the channel. And we're expecting them to put in an application to dump off Cardiff Bay again. They haven't put that in yet, but we're expecting it any day. And EDF have said if they get permission from both to dump at both sites, they will choose one or the other. That's where we're on at that. It's been discussed again at the Senate Petitions Committee next Tuesday morning, because there's been some more correspondence going back and forth. But it's a long, hard, grind. It's often described as death by consultation. Yeah, it just goes on and on and on. We shall have to wait and see what comes of that. In the meantime, it turned out that the English Environment Agency originally suggested a different site much further out in the Bristol Channel, which EDF turned down. We don't know why they turned down. So, yeah, they might want to do more dumping off Cardiff Bay if they get a license. They might want to do more off Portishead if they get the license. If both of those are turned down, they'll have to look at something else to do with the sediment that they're digging up. The issue with the sediment is, of course, it contains anything that's been washed out of the outflow pipes of Hinkley Point A and Hinkley Point B since they started operating in 1965-ish. We know that there was accidents at Hinkley Point A in 1969 involving releases of plutonium. And that stuff has been at the bottom of the Bristol Channel for 50 odd years. It's not an ideal location for it, but once you churn it up, you're letting it loose into the environment again. And if you dump it at sea, you have no idea where it's going to end up.
Yep, that's the issue with long-lived isotopes, isn't it? That they're going to be with us for millions of years, effectively. So we are creating a huge problem for the future. So, Carl, I just wonder if I could come back to you before we go out with questions of the audience, just to bring us up to date on Wylfa. And I think the thing that particularly enraged me was to see the Welsh government at the point that Horizon had said this is no longer economically viable and wrote off 2 billion or whatever they'd spent on it, that our government should leap in and suggest they buy the site as a, you know, an economic opportunity or something. I don't know exactly what they said, but would you just like to bring us up to date with where that is and what you think's going on there, maybe?
Well, certainly I can try. If anybody knows, of course, because I think it's beyond comprehension for most people as to why they've shown interest. Just 3 or 4 days after the Nuclear Inspectorate said quite publicly that they would not be giving permission for Horizon to proceed should they wish to. So, you know, having been told that the environmental concerns in the area would have been formidable, they wouldn't be granting permission. That doesn't mean, of course, that the minister couldn't have overruled the inspector, but nevertheless, the considered view by the inspectorate was that he shouldn't go ahead. In spite of that, Mark Drakeford and his team said, we want to buy it in case somebody's interested in future. Beyond comprehension, why would they invest in something where we've seen RWE pull out, Aon pull out, because they were the founders of Horizon, of course. We've seen Rosatom toy with the idea of taking it on, not go ahead. A Chinese CGN had also played with the idea for a time. And then we've seen more recently, we saw Bechtel, Westinghouse and Southern Company, again, toying with the idea. But of course, Hitachi, having spent, what, 8 years, I think, in total on the site, ruining it, trashing a lot of the coastline there, decided they also, as you say, having spent £2 billion, were no longer felt, despite a £500 million bribe, incidentally, from Westminster, they were still not interested in going ahead. The economic case didn't start like that. So beyond comprehension, one could talk about the SMNRs, the possibility of those going there. I mean, I don't want to perhaps move the conversation onto that immediately, but again, it's a non-starter from our point of view. And I think anybody looking at SMNRs long term can see that the reason the nuclear power stations got ever bigger was because the smaller ones were not economically viable. That's why they went bigger. So if you go back to small scale again, you'd need something like 10 or 12 on any one site, including Trafodaeth. People that don't seem to walk up to that fact yet, to make them viable. And the other thing I think I can throw in the ring is, at this moment in time, of course, there isn't an SMNR anywhere in the world that is operating and producing electricity. So why should we be an experiment when it's, again, raising people's hopes and expectations? I would argue to no avail. And the opportunity cost for renewable energy is huge. because all the money that's been spent, not just by Hitachi, but our own government and the local authority, is millions. We've asked them what the implications are for the local authority. Chief executives had a letter from PAWB, no reply to date.
Yeah.
So Hitachi pulled out, and others have shown interest but have slipped by. So why Welsh Government? Who knows? Time will tell. I'm not convinced it's a good investment, put it like that. Would you put your money there?
I certainly wouldn't invest, I have to say. I think there are some better places to put my money, such as Awel Aman Tawe, which I am an investor in. I'm just now going to invite people from the floor to ask from the audience to ask questions. I mean, you can either put your hand up in the kind of traditional way and give us a wave, or for those of you who are familiar with Zoom, there is that kind of function, and you can put your hand up like that if you wish. So I'm going to wait and see if anybody's going to put their hand up. We got any questions that anybody wants to ask? You can see David Lowry down there. So I'm in the hands of Gaz, who's going to...
David, I'm just going to spotlight you to bring you in with everyone else, and then you're welcome to ask away.
Yeah. Okay, David, do you want to ask your question?
Okay. Yes, what I wanted to ask was about parliamentary representation for the people of Ynys Môn. At the moment, there's a Conservative MP representing the constituency, and it has in recent past been represented by other political parties as well. But they all seem to have a common cause, and they all seem to be in support of new nuclear power. It doesn't matter what their party's own national policy is. For this particular constituency, there seems to be a special policy. Could you make some comment on whether or not you feel that this is fair representation for the people of the island, who don't seem to be able to elect anybody to the Westminster Parliament who could represent the policy which is opposing a new nuclear power plant on the island?
That's a very, very good question, David. I wish I knew the answer. I think David Gillam picked up earlier the fact that we should be far more positive about the interests of people, the real interests of people. I think that social survey, science survey that was done, I mentioned earlier, 74% of the people of the island were supportive of more energy jobs in renewable energy and only 35% in nuclear energy. That's a scientific study, the only one, incidentally, that we're aware of that's been done anywhere by anybody. And there's never been a vote, of course, on the island in favour of nuclear power, or a debate on nuclear power at that level. Why are the politicians, if the mantra repeatedly is we need the jobs, we need a mix, we need the jobs, we need a mix. The renewable, of course, has its place, they wouldn't deny that, they all say that. But jobs, jobs, jobs. And somehow it's very difficult to break through that. We have a media, the local press, the North Wales Chronicle, the Herald, they're all very much the same. And I have to say the BBC are very much in tow as well. Rarely do you get an objective debate. It's usually, they usually pump out what Horizon has been telling them. I mean, I'll never forget, I visited Aon when Aon were the original partners of Horizon. I visited Aon's AGM in Essen in Germany for that meeting. 5,000 people in the audience. The board of directors, 21, I think it was on the stage. And shareholder after shareholder, investor after investor stood up and said, this is not the way ahead. At home, we were being told it was. This is not the way ahead for nuclear energy. It's not the way ahead. Invest in renewables. I went home. I tried to say that to one or two people. The press, were still reporting for weeks and weeks afterwards that this was the way ahead. Nuclear power was the future. Jobs were required. Of course, within 6 months, Horizon, in other words, RWE and Aon had pulled out. So, you know, people do have a voice. They certainly did in Germany. Is it our communication skills? I don't know. or are we just unfortunate with the media we have, David? I don't know, David, Larry. David, it's a difficult one. The Greens have never made any inroad. We've got a particularly gung-ho politician, and Virginia Crosby, the Conservative at the moment, who's appalling in her support. She's extreme in her support. Seems totally uncontrollable. She's chairing a committee, which is, she's only been in 2 months, two years. So within a couple of months, she was chairing a committee looking at all things energy-wise, and I despair at times. But then I despair of lots of things that the government's doing at the moment.
Yeah, well, let's not get on to general despair with our current government. I'll be here a long time. How about you, Brian? Have you got any thoughts about that?
No, it's I'm very familiar with the situation in Anglesey, and it's just horrible. It's just horrible. That's all you can say about it, really.
One interesting fact that, as David raised it, different parties, it's the only constituency in the whole of the UK that's been represented by what one might call the 4 main parties. So Conservative now and previously, Labour, Plaid, and the Liberals as they were. An interesting coffee morning or pub question for you.
And all of them pro-nuclear MPs. I mean, I don't like too much into conspiracy theories, but there does seem to be a kind of pattern there. And I mean, I kind of recently attended a webinar about this and listened to some energy experts who basically said there is no possible explanation under any kind of government energy policy for continuing with nuclear. It's so far out of line with any kind of economic forecast that the Treasury would normally use on any kind of public investment, that the only possible explanation you can have for it is the requirement as bomb factories effectively producing plutonium and uranium for our independent, says the big inverted commas, nuclear weapons. And increasing that just does seem, there's no, I don't know, I mean, I throw it open to the floor, somebody come up with a better theory, because it just feels like there is an overriding thing, like Carl said, there's a £500 million bribe, yeah, I mean, it kind of feels we're back in that loop. Go, Carl.
Just to reaffirm what you're saying, because it's not just a theory. I mean, if you go back to the Public Accounts Committee at Westminster of October 2018, Meg Hillier, as chair, actually asked the Chief Civil Servant in Defence, at one occasion Chief Civil Servant in DEC as it was, of their relationship. And they both readily admitted, and it's on record, that there was a cross-fertilization of nuclear skills, one to the other, that one that wouldn't be viable in terms of its nuclear technology professional skills without the other. So that's on record. And then Rolls-Royce, I think it was the following week, the same audit committee, Rolls-Royce again admitted that this would be a ready entree for them into the arena, that they had every reason to think that SMRs, in their case, SMNRs, that they would also be very much part of the nuclear weapons agenda. And of course, by now, the nuclear civic agenda as well.
And in other countries, President Macron in France is on record as saying the same thing. And in America, they've said the same thing. I mean, sense that government admits that is what they're in business for, and that's sort of accepted part of the public debate. And I think what's interesting here is that's not even, it doesn't really surface, particularly in the media. And that's part of, I mean, again, I don't know, David Lowry might have a view on this as well. I mean, in a sense, why can't we just as adults say, look, that's what's going on, that's it, and that's the reason, and then have a debate about, do we actually want to build a bomb factory in Anglesey, and that, that might move the conversation on a bit. I don't know.
Well, I don't think it is. I don't think it's as simple as the way you're putting it, David.
Fair enough.
I think the military connection isn't so much wanting to build new nuclear facilities to produce nuclear materials for warheads, which was the reason for the original Magnox designs and was the way in which the first Wylfa reactor was used. The plutonium from the first Wylfa reactor almost certainly went into UK and probably American warheads as well. The reason in the modern time is that the military nuclear navy is afraid that it will lose its skill base if it doesn't have a parallel commercial civilian program running, which is helping to educate and train up and skill up a new generation of talent, so that when they want to move on to the next generation of submarine reactors for the successor submarines to the current Trident submarines, they want to make sure that they have a workforce. And because the small modular nuclear reactors are of a similar type, not identical, but of a similar type to the ones that you would put into a submarine for propulsion, same kind of skill base would be needed for small modular reactor program, which is why there's now a tendency, at least in the nuclear proponents in Whitehall, to be more attracted towards a small modular nuclear reactor program than a new gigawatt program. And everybody has seen how the gigawatt program, first of all, we saw it at Wylfa, we then saw it at the proposed giant nuclear plant alongside Sellafield. We've seen the problems that they've had for Sizewell C and Bradwell B in East Anglia. And the reason why they're not getting support so much from the Treasury is because they're too expensive to build and they're not competitive with other ways of producing low carbon electricity. Whereas small modular reactors, they have a similar problem in producing radioactive waste. They're similarly expensive, but they have the benefit, at least as far as Whitehall is concerned, is they provide a skilled workforce that can be redeployed by Rolls-Royce and others in the nuclear navy. So I think that's a more complicated explanation, but I think it's probably more close to what's happening than any attempt to build any new reactors for more fissile material, because they've got about 160,000 kilograms of plutonium at Sellafield. When you think you can make a bomb out of 5 kilograms, how many warheads do they really need? So I don't think there's a real push for any more fissile materials. In fact, it's a problem rather than an asset now, because they don't know how to manage it as a waste. But certainly in terms of because nuclear has fallen out of being a popular thing for university students to study, because a new nuclear reactor hasn't been built in Sizewell B and Hinkley C. There was a huge time period where nothing was happening in terms of reactor development. So very few students wanted to study it at university. Radioactive waste is not such an attractive place to be going into, even though there's going to be long-term job requirements in nuclear waste management and decommissioning. So if you want a job for life, go into radioactive waste management or decommissioning if you like nuclear. So I think that's why they've had a skills problem, and this is the way they think they can solve it, by having a big push for small modular reactors, making use of the sites of the decommissioned power plants, and that's why Trust Fund has also become an attractive option for them. And it's a way for Rolls-Royce to keep themselves in the nuclear market, and the government to have a skills base for the reactor force. So I would say that taking them together, I mean, there's a logic in it, what the government wants to do, but they won't say it in public because they know that they spent about 3 decades trying to say there's no relationship between civil and military nuclear energy. If they now say, oh yes, well there is actually, and it's a good thing, I think that they have a credibility problem. And that's why in France and America, where they haven't made such a big argument about there being a distinction between the two civil and military nuclear activities, it's easier for them to now make a positive out of it. In this country, where they've made a big strong case for there being a distinction, even though there wasn't actually a distinction in this country, they don't want to come back to it and then open it up again. I think that's the explanation for it, and why it's not politically possible to do that, even though the civil service in Whitehall and Rolls-Royce as a private company are very keen on it.
Well, a point well made, David. I mean, I've heard the story of the schools base, and the what you've said is a more finessed kind of take on it all. It seems a very expensive skills training program to my way of thinking. There must be cheaper ways to keep engineers skilled than have to actually buy them such an expensive toy to play with, shall we say?
But I just want to add one more comment to that, though. It's because, I mean, what's happened is that the nuclear sector has been very poor at building, and in my judgment, very poor at operating nuclear reactors. But what it has been very good at is actually organising its own nuclear lobby. So the reason why you're seeing this coming up is because the nuclear lobby opens doors in Whitehall, opens doors with people who are interested in doing nuclear projects, such as Rolls-Royce. So even though it's not a rational way of doing it, and as you say, training up a special force in order to design and finesse a submarine reactor might be a more sensible thing to do. But this is also the outcome of a big nuclear lobby that's been going on for the last 15 years between the last big reactor and other SMRs. So you can understand the logic of it, though I don't agree with that. But I can understand the logic of why it's emerged this way, rather than being done in what I might regard as a rational way, which is, look, what do you need? Can we train our people to do it? And can we have a dedicated, several university departments doing that in order to achieve the aim? That might be the rational way. But, as I might say, when has the nuclear industry done anything rational?
Indeed. Well put. Gaz, I can see that Nina Weatherhead has got.
Yes, I'm just going to bring Nina in. So Nina, if you give us 2 seconds, if you want to put on your video,
yeah,
you're more than welcome to.
Hi, it's I think the video is on, but we haven't got a light on or something. I'm not sure. Anyway, so I was just wondering if we can use the act of what's it called? I had it in my head earlier.
Future generation.
Yeah, I mean, surely that it goes completely against the future generations, because we're just lumping it onto the future to deal with, and the whole idea is no waste, and that clearly has waste. On anything else, you can use the waste for other things. I mean, yes, nuclear, I guess, but yeah, I was just wondering if that's been a headway that you can use at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question about, we have I often when I'm outside Wales, I boast about the Future Generation Wellbeing Future Generations Act and say what a wonderful piece of legislation it is. But in this case, it doesn't seem to actually have any purchase, shall we say. So I wonder what you thought about that. Well, who would like to go first? Oh, Brian, yeah, and then come to Carl.
Yeah, we did try to engage the Future Generations Commission on the Hinkley mud issue, but essentially she avoided the issue by saying, well, according to NRW, legally the sediment's not classified as nuclear waste, which just means that the amount of radiation in it is below the legal definition for what nuclear waste is, and therefore it was just ordinary waste, and she had no comment on it, which we found very disappointing, and we haven't yet found a way of engaging her on this issue. That's all I can say about that at the moment, and it's complicated. Oh, it's complicated because nuclear power is a Westminster issue, whereas nuclear waste is it's devolved to Wales. All waste issues are devolved to Wales, including nuclear waste. But the decision about whether or not there should be a nuclear power station which will produce that nuclear waste in Wales is still a decision that remains at Westminster. So there's ample room for passing the buck there between civil servants and politicians at Westminster and in Cardiff Bay.
Yeah, just to echo what Brian's saying, really. I mean, I've spoken with Sophie Howe about this before now. I've been in correspondence with her office as well. the reality is, as good as the legislation appears, and one finds it very difficult to criticise the legislation as it stands, with one exception, that is, it doesn't have any teeth. There's nothing they can do to enforce the legislation. So it's advisory, essentially. Good advice always, I guess, for the most part anyway, but not able to enforce. And that is a big weakness. And we need to be mindful of that. Could I perhaps just, as you remind me in raising that, Jane Davidson, of course, is currently chairing the investigation on the mud in the bay there. I had a conversation with Jane Davidson once, who I got to know her quite well when I was medical director in health, and she used to come into meetings quite a lot. And following her retirement as an AM, I met up with her up in North Wales on a BBC Radio Wales programme. This is relevant, believe me. And she wanted to do an interview walking along the coast and seeing. And after we'd done the work, as it were, sat down for a coffee in Nantgwrth. And I thought, there's nothing lost here. I'm going to ask her, why is Carwyn Jones taking a totally different line from Rodney Morgan, who had said we didn't need nuclear power quite clearly at one point in the chamber? Why does Carwyn Jones take a different line? She looked me in the eye, straight in the eye, and said, unite. And I think that is where we should be putting a lot more pressure on the unions, because at the moment they're in hock to nuclear power. Well, nuclear power is in hock to the unions. They see it as a unionized industry, of course, which it is. Renewable energy is, and they see themselves very much the champions of work in that industry, workforce in that industry.
So just drawing that out a little, I mean, you feel then that the Labour Party in Cardiff, in Senate and so on, is, in hock to unite, and so that the ability of, in a sense, the trades unions to set the agenda, or to is really where you might try and get in and prize them apart a little bit with the right kind of.
I do believe that. Yeah, I think the unions clearly have a huge impact or influence on the party, and or equally, somebody such as Carwyn Jones, who presumably is a member of Unite, then must be under some pressure to conform, as it were. Right. Whereas Rod wasn't.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that, Brian, or is that, you feel that's a fairly straight looking you in the eye, and that's the problem kind of conversation?
Yeah, I can believe there's some truth in that. It's also a case, well, I think, I don't know, politicians are strange people, aren't they? Rodney Morgan made a big deal about a clear red water between him and the Blair government, and had opinions on everything apart from on the Gulf War, of course. Carwyn, I just think he probably thought the easiest course of action was not to make a fuss about it, and it will either happen because the Westminster government will say so, and we'll go along with it and gain the benefits and the risks, of course, or it won't happen, and there's no reason for him to stake his political future on it. Maybe, I mean, I've been in other meetings with other politicians, and sometimes you do get the feeling that strategic cowardice is part of the job.
Strategic cowardice, right? Okay. So I'm just thinking we're coming up to about an hour. Has anybody else in the audience got a question that they'd like to ask at this point? Scanning. No. Okay, so I just maybe as a wrap up and round up at the end, I'll ask the two panelists. I mean, if we're going forward now and we are trying to keep, nuclear power stations from being built in Wales and so on, I mean, in a sense, we've looked at the government, we've looked at the Future Generations Commissioner or the trade unions. I mean, where do you think there is potential to put public pressure, or is there something around which people, in a sense, could represent what I think is the majority view of people in Wales, that this is not something we want, we should just, put it behind us and forget it? Is the thing that you might is worth either campaigning on or writing on, whatever you feel might be worth thinking about?
Well, stating the obvious, David, if I may, we've got a Senate election coming up in May, of course.
Yeah.
Candidates usually courting us for their votes, and I'm certainly aware of some candidates who are very much of the same view as ourselves. And we need to make sure that others, how can I say, well, first of all, that they're elected, but we need to challenge them all as to what their view is, and make sure they're aware that there is a view counter to what has traditionally been the case in the Welsh government. Because not every member of the government at the moment, of course, is supportive of nuclear power. And we need to make sure that those that aren't become a majority, if you like, for whatever party. So yeah, I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned, incidentally, because is it part of the agenda? There is particular interest on the Wylfa site as we speak, not from Welsh Government, but from a company called Shearwater Energy. And they're looking for a hybrid of wind power plus 12 SMNRs on the coast there. And remember, this is a European designated area conservation, SAC, or an SPA, specially protected area, both conservation areas of extreme international significance. We should be lobbying. I mean, I despair at times that I don't see Greenpeace in Wales or Friends of the Earth in Wales, Countryside for the Prevention of Protection of Rural Wales, actively campaigning. I think there's a lot more that they could be doing in the lobby of the corridors.
Fair point. I'm going to go, but I see Nina, or not Nina, has got a finger up. But I'll just go to Brian and then I'll come to you. Is that okay? Yeah.
Following on from what Carl said, one of the things that the CND Cymru is doing at the moment is emailing all the Senedd election candidates with a little questionnaire, 5 questions, but the last 2 are relevant to this discussion. One is asking what their opinion would be on any proposed new nuclear stations, whether SMR, small nuclear or large nuclear, and what their attitude towards nuclear waste is in Wales. Now, I don't know how many of them will reply, but our intention is to get as many replies as possible, of course, and we'll be putting that information out on our website and social media and so on.
Okay, well, that should be good. And so I'm going to come to whoever's not Nina on the Weatherhead computer.
My name is Bob Weatherhead, so close. I was just thinking of something visual to get other people involved or to make them notice. Maybe consider putting, you were talking about the map of Fukushima fallout and then imposing that on. It'd be interesting to put signs up on roads around those sort of borders, however far away they are, of nuclear fallout zone, whatever, from that point. It would be interesting to see exactly where those are, and to let those local people know that they would have to move out if that happened. Might be a something visually useful to know.
That's a very interesting suggestion. I don't think it's ever raised its head in PAWB meetings. We try to circulate the map in certain quarters, certainly, and this is the first year, in fact, in the 10 years that we've not been able to hold a protest on the bridge on the 11th, on Ynni Bridge, which have been supported by the police, and interestingly by a large number of cars, usually expressing their support, occasional finger up, but vast majority hooting their horns in support. So, but I take your point.
I saw it in a very much more theatrical way of people in hazmat suits, you know, stopping people and say, you know, and making it more of an actual art piece or something if you had a campaign day. But I think at the moment you could certainly just put signs up and just let people notice.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll certainly convey that back to the group.
Certainly, many years ago, I dropped floats off the side of a boat off Sellafield and off Hinkley, and I mean, the most effective thing is they you know, end up on a beach, you know, and people go, well, so the local paper does get rather excited by the, you know, slightly unscientific idea that the whatever's coming down the Sellafield waste pipe might be where they walk their dog. You know, it does generate a little bit of letters page in the local paper. I mean, I think it's kind of interesting. Bristol City Council, I mean, you know, they are, if the wind's from the southwest and Hinkley goes off, you know, Bristol is right in the way. And Bristol City Council at one point looked at that and looked at whether they could create an evacuation plan for Bristol. And Bristol's got particularly bad traffic, and everybody knows it. And they said, well, basically we'd have to have coaches on standby with their engines running 24 hours a day. So we don't think this is a very feasible use of our taxpayers' money. So we're not going to do it. You know, and you go, yeah, that's the kind of logic of the, you know, Alice in Wonderland logic, isn't it? Really, you know, you just go, oh, well, we can't solve this problem, so we're not going to even think about it. And it does strike me very, very odd, really, that Bristol isn't a bit more. I mean, given that they really are downwind in a pretty direct way, and you know, the winds from the southwest, as anybody who lives on the West Wales coast knows, you know, it doesn't take long for that stuff to get up the Severn and be, you know, flying over Bristol. So I'm always slightly amazed that Bristolians aren't, you know, manning the barricades a bit more. But anyhow, so I mean, that's enough from me, and I think that's a good time to wrap up. And oh, sorry, David, have you got your hand up, or are you just?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, I wanted to just make a comment on what Bob just asked. Earlier on today, I participated in a webinar coming from Vienna, and it was for the Cities for a Nuclear-Free Europe. And during this webinar, there was a presentation of the Peter model developed by an Austrian think tank called Flex Risk. And what it did was it modeled nuclear accidents from each of the nuclear reactors in all of Europe. And you could put in various pieces of data, and it would show you, depending on which way the wind was blowing, what the temperature was, and various other aspects of the accident. It could show you where the plume from the accident might go. And that might be exactly the kind of thing you could do for Wylfa. If you Google Flex Risk, it will come up, and the person who developed it explained how they worked the program. And I'm sure if you emailed her, her name is Gabrielle Mraz, M-R-A-Z. And she's based at an ecology think tank in Vienna. I'm sure they could do it for Wylfa, and it would be exactly the kind of thing that Bob just asked about, and might make a very good visual presentation for those who want to use it in the political debate over Ynys and whether nuclear should play a part in its future.
Thanks, David. Very useful. I think there was quite a few people scrolling that down on the piece of paper next to them to check it out and see what it is. And obviously, if you decided that wind was coming from the southeast at Hinkley, it wouldn't be long before it was over Cardiff. So, you know, you can change your parameters and get a different scenario. So thank you for that, David. And thank you, Carl, for your presentation and your input, and indeed, Brian. And we've got some applause coming from the floor. This has been recorded and it will be going up on YouTube. And, you know, we have got, you know, a number of people watching the film about Fukushima. So I hope it continues this debate really and keeps it, you know, live. And yeah, one day we'll get there, Brian.
I'm sure.
Another 40 years.
Yeah. Okay. Goodbye all. Thank you for coming, and see you hopefully at another event or film at the festival.